As you are preparing a speech, you have to evaluate the evidence that you have found to support your arguments, as well as the counter evidence that support counterclaims. So here we're going to introduce this concept of tests of evidence, and there are, I think, 7 different tests of evidence we're going to look at. These tests of evidence don't mean that if a piece of evidence fails the test, so to speak, that you should throw it out. It just shows a potential weakness in the evidence, something that you might need to address in your argumentation or by finding additional supporting evidence. So the first test is accessibility. This simply means, do we have access to the evidence? If not, are we just reporting hearsay? Someone else told me this was the case, or am I going on the basis of what I just think is the case? Something I kind of vaguely remember, I can't find it anymore? That's not really going to cut it. So does the audience have the ability to review the evidence? That's a good test. Can I link them to it? Can I show them it? Can I point them to the part of the public record where they can access the evidence themselves? If not, we might try to find either a way that we can do that or supplementary evidence. Do I have access to the evidence? Is this something that is fully available to me? Was it redacted by the primary source here? Or are there anonymous sources that are cited? There might be different levels of accessibility. There might be very good evidence that poses some obstacles there. And finally, are there obstacles in obtaining the full evidence? That might mean, hey, I'm looking at this video, but it's an edit clearly, or it's a cropped photograph, or maybe I don't know if it's cropped or not, so I need to find the original photograph in order to determine whether it is. Maybe it's a translated piece of evidence, and I don't speak the original language, so I have to go on the basis of what the translator has decided. Maybe I'll try to find other translations. These are some of the barriers to accessibility that might be relevant for a particular piece of evidence. And then there's credibility. Credibility here is, I think, one of the primary tests of evidence, one that many people think about when they're evaluating evidence. Is the source known to be biased? And by bias here, we don't just mean the normal biases that all human beings have, of cognitive bias or of selection bias, or we might have confirmation bias of something. We're really here thinking about, is this a bias that is going to really deeply distort the evidence in a way that we can no longer trust it? So this is the most serious form of bias. Is this a source that is representing a political faction? Is this someone who is profiting directly from the source? Is this representing an industry? So those kinds of questions would be relevant. Sometimes you can find that in, let's say, a scientific report because someone will disclose potential connections that they have. But you might have to see who is funding this, or whether this institution has known biases. That's something you have to look at. Is the credentialing of an expert from a trusted institution? So when the evidence involves expert opinion, what kind of expertise are we talking about here? If there's someone who claims to be a medical doctor is saying something that seems surprising given that position, what institution do they represent? Are they from a trusted medical institution? Did they get their medical degree from an institution that is recognized by the American Medical Association? These are the kinds of questions we might look at. Cui bono? Who might benefit from the distortions or fabrications? So one question we can ask is, if there are distortions or fabrications, who would that benefit? And that might give us a sense of where to look. Now, this isn't supposed to just make us broadly suspicious, because it's probably the case that some piece of evidence can always be seen as being to the advantage of one party or another. That's why it's evidence in a public controversy. But nevertheless, this question might direct us where to look for those sources of bias in our evidence. It's not something that makes us throw it out, just something that we're aware of. How is the evidence produced or handled or disseminated? In a legal court, the question of evidence often involves a question of the chain of custody. Who handled this evidence? Was there a chance that someone may have tampered with it along the way? Is there documentation that show that it was kind of carried from the place where it was first discovered here to the courtroom? Now, that standard can't always be the standard for a public controversy, but things like that of how was it produced? Do we know who made or edited this? Do we know who these people are? Are there anonymous sources involved? Was this disseminated in a way that we understand why it was? All of these are questions that help us think about potential credibility issues that come from the circulation or production of the evidence itself. And are there any indications within the evidence that raise suspicion? So this might be something that is similar to what you might do when you're thinking about whether a piece of mail or an email is a scam or phishing. If it doesn't have a return address on it, well, why would a respected, trusted institution like a bank send something out without saying their name or having a return address? That's pretty suspicious. So using your normal level of suspicion towards those kinds of things might be good to take to evidence that might seem very credible to lots of other people that are looking at it. You should see whether, by evaluating it closely, anything raises a red flag for you. Next, we move to internal consistency. This is when we look at something, let's say it's testimony or someone is giving an account of something. Does it make sense? If someone says, yeah, I got there very early at 6 a.m., right off work, and later on we see evidence in their own statement that they usually get off work at 6 p.m., well, that doesn't really hold up. It's kind of odd to say that you went somewhere right after if it was 12 hours later. So that is a contradiction. Are there claims made or supported by the evidence that contradict one another? This is the question of internal consistency. But there might also be a softer version of this where there are interpretations of the evidence that potentially could contradict one another. So we might look at something from different points of view. Can I take a counterclaim and actually still use this evidence in order to support it? That might be a way to think about internal consistency as well. Next, we'll go to external consistency. Does this evidence fit within the standard accepted picture of the universe? Well, it doesn't have to be the entire universe. It might be the universe of this particular case. If it really stands out, if it's really, really surprising, that doesn't mean that it has to be thrown away. That often it could be a very important or very valuable piece of evidence for us. But if it doesn't fit within that accepted picture, why not? What explains this departure? Can we give an account for what makes it so surprising? Or why all of the other evidence seems to point in another direction? Are there other similar corroborating pieces of evidence that we can bring in here to show that this piece of evidence is consistent with what other things we know? Next, we move on to recency. Is this evidence up to date? If our evidence is really old, it might be up to a high standard for its time, but there may have been new information, new discoveries, new pieces of evidence that it hasn't taken into account. And so its age or its date might make it not the best. So you have to ask that question of recency. Is this the most up-to-date evidence that I can find? Next, there's relevance. Does this evidence support the claim? That seems really obvious, but I have to say that's probably one of the most important and most common weaknesses of evidence. People will often bring forward evidence that's powerful, it's flashy, it's internally consistent, it's very credible. But the question is, does that really support the claim that's being made? And I would say asking that question is always good, and asking it from the point of view of your opponent. What would someone say who wanted to tear down this evidence on the point of view of relevance? Why would they say that it's irrelevant, and how would you come back and meet that claim with a counterclaim? And finally, is it sufficient? If we only had this piece of evidence to go on, would we buy the claim that's being made about it? Probably in most cases, we wouldn't want one piece of evidence, but that might give us a sense of how strong the evidence is. How much more would I need to know if I only had this piece of evidence? And what other evidence do I have in order to support those claims? Is the evidence sufficient to overcome countervailing evidence? Your audience isn't coming to this as a completely ignorant mass. They probably have seen other forms of evidence in the world. But also from an ethical point of view, you want to consider your own case and form your own opinion on the basis of the best evidence. So given that you've done some research and looked into the issue and you've seen some countervailing evidence, could you make a public comparison between this evidence and what is against it and still say that this is the stronger piece? I would recommend doing that in your speech if you can, but that's the test that you should always ask. So these are the tests of evidence that will help you think about whether you have a strong body of evidence in order to support your argument.